These 10 commandments.
Well, this morning we are continuing our That Was Dumb sermon series. So I thought I would start out with one of my most recent dumb moves. Last Friday, after walking William to school and dealing with one of his meltdowns when leaving daycare, a little sleep deprived, I drove into the office. When I passed a Chick-fil-A, I realized I had not had breakfast. So I pulled into an empty drive-thru. Now this is when I thought it was meant to be. I got my breakfast and I went into the office. After parking, I walked into the office with our CEO who wanted to talk. So despite my hunger, I left my breakfast on my desk. After the meeting, I took my then cold breakfast to the kitchen, put it in the microwave, and began to heat it up. Unbeknownst to me, Chick-fil-A biscuits are wrapped in paper with foil on the inside. So as I heard the popping in the microwave, I looked in the microwave, and not only were the biscuits, but the paper bag that the biscuits were in were on fire. Seeing the fire, I began to curse God. I said some other lovely four-letter words, and then I grabbed what was then the bag that was on fire out of the microwave, put it into the sink, and ran water over my breakfast. Luckily, the hair on my arm will grow back. After that, I was mad. I was ticked off. I was embarrassed, and I was red-faced. So I started to clean up the ash that had built up in the microwave and around the microwave. And cursing God just a few moments earlier, I asked him, please, God, don't let the fire alarm in our office building sound. To my surprise, it didn't sound. And as the mess was cleaned up, I began to eat my now very crispy chicken biscuits, and I thought to myself, man, that was dumb. Maybe our mistakes are not as severe as catching the microwave in our offices on fire, as much as some of us may like to. But we've all made some seriously dumb choices that have led to some seriously stellar mistakes, have we not? And when we started our sermon series last week, we learned about Gideon hearing from God. And instead of leaving the wine press and saying, yes, sir, Gideon had the dumb nerve to tell God that he didn't know what he was talking about. Has anyone else ever done that? And this morning, we're going to discuss how Jonah threw a fit when God did not destroy the seat of the Assyrian Empire, Nineveh, and its ruthless inhabitants. We will witness how Jonah became angry and dramatic because people were saved, and how, like a toddler, he threw an angry, dramatic fit, took off, and effectively sat in the corner when his expectations were not met and he did not get his way. Does this sound familiar to anyone? As William's first birthday approaches, Allison and I are learning very quickly about angry, dramatic fits when a toddler does not get his way. But in Jonah's case, He had a right to be angry. Nineveh was the seat of the most ruthless, bloody, and destructive empire of his time. The Assyrians hated the Jewish people and repeatedly attempted to dominate and enslave them. And the Jewish people feared the wrath and the rule of the Assyrians. Think about it for a moment. Nineveh was located where Mosul, Iraq sits today. And the Assyrian Empire would be like ISIS, having control over the Tigris-Euphrates region, all of the Middle East, and Asia Minor. And how we feel about ISIS today is magnified by the way Jonah felt about the Assyrians and the Ninevites. So Jonah's concern about justice and the judgment of God against these wicked people was justified. But what about grace? When we step back and think about it, we're a lot like Jonah. We want justice and not so much grace. But our heart's desires should be for everyone to turn away from their wickedness and to God, no matter how awful they have been. I don't know about you, but in a time when the news is constantly filled with stories about domestic terrorism, mass shootings, when we hear divisive political rhetoric, when we read about hate, and when we witness a society divided on racial and socioeconomic lines, it's hard to believe that anyone can forgive anyone else for anything, much less their awful words and actions. But that is what God calls us to do, to pray for our enemies and to forgive them. And the 4th chapter of Jonah is just that, a call for Jonah and us to forgive our enemies. When I hear the name Jonah, I imagine most of us don't think about forgiving our enemies. I imagine most of us think about a guy and a whale. And while Jonah was swallowed up and spit out by a big fish in chapters 2 and 3, the story of the prophet Jonah is a short story that has been shaking up its listeners for over 2,500 years. So what's happening in this satirical story? Jonah is running from God's call to deliver God's message of repentance to Israel's enemies. And God has the nerve to call Jonah to deliver a message to a nation whose actions and political practices were horrifying and gruesome. Instead of obeying God's request, Jonah takes the first boat out of town. He sets sail for the city of Tarshish, which was in Spain, the furthest point from the Assyrian Empire he could get. No sooner than Jonah is in the boat and settled, a storm kicks up and frightens the most skilled sailors. Jonah knows the storm's about him, and it was unmistakable that it was a message from God saying, "Hey, Jonah, you're going in the wrong direction." So Jonah openly admits to the sailors, "It's about me. I'm running away from my Lord. Pick me up and throw me overboard. That will cause the storm to stop." So after praying to the Hebrew God first, the sailors throw Jonah overboard. The sea ceases from raging, and the pagan sailors, ironically, accept and pray to God. More ironically, Jonah is not running from God out of fear of what he's called to do. Rather, he's running from his call because he knows God well enough to foresee what's going to happen. Jonah knows that God is the God of second, third, fourth, and fifth chances. He knows that God is merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. Therefore, Jonah knew that if the Ninevites repented, God would forgive them. And Jonah wants no part of that. Forgiveness for his enemies? Come on, that's ridiculous. The Assyrians deserve justice. So Jonah wants them destroyed. Jonah runs from God because of his resentment toward his enemies. This story pointedly speaks to our human resistance to forgive. Deep down, we all appreciate the scriptures that speak of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Retributive justice is easy to imagine. Revenge and payback seem fair. When we are afraid and hurt, all we want to do is what our nature inclines us to do, to nurse our wounds and enact justice and revenge. And in the swirling of our pain and our revenge, we ignore the truth that we are capable of committing the same wrongdoings as our enemies. But God's not like us. He's bigger than us. And His grace and mercy that manifest through Christ are the standard. Through Christ's love, God raises the bar, and He proves that His nature is merciful, slow to anger, and ready to forgive. And God forgives Jonah for his disobedience. While Jonah is going over the edge of the boat into dark waters, God extends an olive branch in the form of a whale. That's a pretty big branch. And after Jonah's 3-day retreat in the belly of that whale, he is spit out because Jonah receives the word of the Lord a second time. This time, Jonah agrees to go to Nineveh, the very city and people that he despises. Clearly, it's easier said than done to have compassion for our enemies. But God teaches us how to replace hatred with compassion. This requires us to honestly enter into their suffering. And if we do, we will be changed. Through compassion, our desire for vengeance is transformed. Yet we cannot honestly allow ourselves to see through our enemies' eyes, to walk in their shoes, or to feel what they feel without the melting of our hearts. And the best way to do this is to remember that God has extended them the same forgiveness, the same mercy, and the same grace that He has extended to each of us. God extends us grace because His ultimate desire is not retribution. God's ultimate desire is relationship. Not retribution, but relationship. So it is we who keep ourselves separated from God and one another. And when we hold tightly to our pain and resentment and refuse to feel compassion or forgive our enemies, we become shackled by them, and that separation grows. Given our self-imposed separation, Jonah's dumb choice was his attempt to not allow God to extend a chance of forgiveness to the Ninevites. If they did not turn from their horrific ways, God planned to bring judgment upon Nineveh, and Jonah thought, good, they deserve it. So Jonah gets into this huge city and delivers a sermon that consists of 5 Hebrew words or 8 English words. 40 days more and Nineveh will be overthrown. Despite Jonah doing the bare minimum, the people of Nineveh believed God's proclamation, proclaimed a fast, and everyone, even the king himself, put sackcloth on with ashes. Sackcloth is even put on the animals. The king calls for a complete overhaul of their violent and oppressive systems. Talk about a leader choosing humility, admitting his mistakes, and making reparations for his actions. That was it. The Ninevites repented, and God changed his mind and relented from the calamity that he had planned. Yet Jonah's not happy. He's angry. He's ticked off. He's red-faced. And he's mad. Instead of rejoicing in God's graciousness, in his anger, Jonah accuses God. I knew you'd do that. I knew it. Isn't that what I said you'd do while I was back in my hometown? It's just like you to forgive. But God replies, what is it to you? What right do you have to be angry? With his unresolved anger and self-righteousness, Jonah leaves the city, finds a hill that overlooks Nineveh, builds a booth, and sits pouting underneath it. As Jonah pouts, we see that he has more pity on himself than for the 120,000 people that were just saved through the 8-word sermon that he clearly phoned in. Like Jonah, do we prefer judgment over grace for our enemies? Do we want revenge and retribution more than God? Do we take pleasure in knowing that some people will get the justice that we believe is fair and that they deserve? Like toddlers and young children, our nature desires fairness. That is, if he hits me, I hit him back. If she hurts me, I hurt her back. But God says that's not how this works. We see this in how God tries to evoke Jonah's compassion. After sending a bush to cool Jonah down and protect him from the heat of the very hot and very oppressive Iraqi desert, Jonah is comforted by God as he waits in effectively a courtside seat for God to change his mind and destroy the city of Nineveh. Yet the next morning, God sends a worm that eats the plant and causes it to wither. Seeing this, Jonah is madder than ever and makes another dumb choice to argue with God once again. In this exchange, we see Jonah throw a toddler-like fit and turn his back on God. In his mercy, God tells Jonah, "You are concerned about the bush, for which you did not labor and which you did not grow. It came into being in a night and perished in a night. And should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city in which there are 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left, and also many animals?" Rather than providing Jonah's response, the book ends with the implication that God was gracious to Nineveh, that God was gracious to Jonah, and that God is gracious to us. Since God forgives and is gracious to us, we must be gracious and forgiving to each other. So who is your Nineveh? Who are you running from while hanging on to your anger? Who do you need to forgive today? You see, the story of Jonah subverts our human understanding of justice and calls us to forgive by asking, can God's grace and love be unjust? This is the radical nature of God, who is at the same time just and merciful. Mercy is not getting what we deserve. Grace is getting what we don't deserve. And compassion is God sticking with us even when we're at our worst. It's not fair. It's not easy. But in God's way, it's just. And if we're genuinely honest with ourselves, it's exceedingly good news for all of us. Since God is just, rather than throwing an angry fit when something goes wrong, like catching a microwave on fire, or when we don't get our way, like a melting down toddler, or when someone hurts us, or when someone attacks and opens fire on our communities. Let's learn from Jonah's dumb choices. Let's let go of the anger that holds us back. And let's forgive our enemies, knowing that God has extended them the same mercy, the same grace, and the same compassion that He has extended each of us. Friends, pray with me.
Thank you for joining us today. We want you to know, no matter where you are or how you worship with us, you are always part of our church family. We would love to have you join us live downtown at 8:45 or 11 o'clock, or as always, through the broadcast. We would love to hear from you. If you have a question about today's service, if you would like to contact one of our pastors, if we can pray for you in any way, please reach out to us through our church website. Thanks for worshiping with us today. It was great to have you with us.